Hey, my friends.
I asked our daughter, Yulia, a simple question over the phone. When is the family wedding dinner? She didn't hesitate, didn't soften her voice, didn't even pretend to check a calendar. Mom, Dad, she said calmly. It already happened. Only the people we considered important were there. I looked at my wife, Marlena, and she gave me that small, steady glance that means, don't rush, watch. I let the silence sit long enough to make it heavy. Then I said, good to know. The way you might compliment a waiter for bringing you an empty plate. Yulia gave a little laugh like she'd won a tiny argument, and I thought, that's the problem with small victories. People start believing they're kings. I've lived long enough to recognize a new rule the moment it's announced, especially when it's delivered with a smile. This wasn't about a dinner or the wedding or who sat closest to the bride. It was about our place being reassigned without our consent. Marlena didn't ask me what I wanted to do, because she already knew we don't perform emotion for people who aren't listening. We ended the call politely, and I stared at the quiet kitchen like it was a courtroom where the verdict had just been read. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments how old you are and where you're from. For you, it's just a small thing. But for me, it's the reason I keep telling these stories. After that, I washed one mug that was already clean, an old habit of mine when I'm thinking, and Marlena smirked and said, if you scrub it any harder, it'll confess. I answered, I'm not scrubbing the mug, and she understood exactly what I meant. We didn't call Yulia back, we didn't text, we didn't ask for an explanation, because explanations are for people who still believe respect is accidental. We simply started looking at our world the way you look at a door after someone quietly changed the locks. 2 days later, when the phone rang again and Yulia's name lit up the screen, I didn't feel surprise, just timing. And when I answered, my voice was calm, but the decision behind it was already moving. When Yulia called again, her voice carried urgency dressed up as confidence, like someone knocking while already testing the handle. She didn't ask how we were, which saved time and confirmed my earlier conclusion. Mom, Dad, I need $55,000, she said, clean and direct, as if naming a grocery item. I paused, not because I needed to think, but because pauses tell people more than answers ever do. Marlena raised an eyebrow and slid the phone a little closer to me, the way a card dealer invites a bet. I pictured the wedding table we hadn't been invited to and wondered how many chairs $55,000 would have bought. I said, that's a specific number, and Yulia exhaled like she'd been waiting for permission to explain her math. She talked about timelines, deposits, pressure, and how everyone else already helped, which made me smile, quietly, because everyone else always appears right before respect disappears. A chair creaked under me as I leaned back. It's an old chair with opinions, and it voices them at inconvenient moments. Marlena whispered, careful, not as a warning, but as encouragement to enjoy the view. I told Yulia we'd discuss it and call her back, and she rushed to add, please don't take too long, which was generous advice from someone who'd already taken her time with us. When the call ended, the kitchen felt organized, like a chessboard after the pieces finally make sense. I reached for the wrong cupboard and found the blender instead of the cups, which made Marlena laugh and say, you're plotting again. I replied, no, and corrected myself, I'm measuring. Because when money enters the conversation this late, it's never about need, it's about leverage. That night, as Marlena poured tea and didn't add sugar on purpose, we both knew the next call would change more than a number on a screen. The next morning, I woke up before the alarm, which is how my mind tells me something is already underway. Marlena was at the table with her notebook open, not writing, just looking at a single page like it might confess if stared at long enough. I poured coffee and missed the mug by half an inch, spilled a thin river across the counter, and said, see, even the coffee knows it's a day for mistakes. She handed me a towel and replied, just not our mistakes, with that calm certainty that steadies a room. I thought about the wedding dinner again, not as a slight, but as a calculation someone else made using our absence as currency. When people decide you're optional, they often assume your resources are still mandatory. Yulia texted mid-morning. No greeting, just a question mark, and I admired the efficiency. Impatience has a way of telling the truth faster than words. I didn't respond right away, because speed would have implied negotiation, and we weren't negotiating, we were observing. Instead, I opened a folder I hadn't touched in years, the kind people forget exists because it doesn't announce itself. Marlena glanced over and said, "You're opening that now?" Not surprised, just confirming the face. I nodded and said, "She asked for money." This is where money remembers who taught it manners. I found my reading glasses in the refrigerator 10 minutes later and laughed at myself, because even precision allows room for comedy. When I finally answered Yulia's text with, "We'll talk tonight," my phone stayed quiet longer than usual, which told me she'd felt the shift. Silence like that doesn't happen by accident. It's the sound of someone realizing the floor isn't where they thought it was. By evening, as the sun dropped and Marlena closed her notebook with a soft, final tap, I knew the next conversation wouldn't be about dollars at all. That evening, I set the phone face down on the table and let it ring twice before picking up, not as a tactic, but as a reminder to myself that urgency is contagious if you let it be. Yulia started talking before I finished saying hello, her words stacked neatly like boxes she expected me to carry. She mentioned deadlines again, vendors, embarrassment, and how it would look bad if things fell apart now, which told me appearances were her real currency. I listened, nodded, and accidentally sat on my reading glasses, snapping one arm clean off, which felt oddly appropriate. Marlena didn't laugh this time. She simply slid me the spare pair she keeps precisely for moments like these. When Yulia finally paused, I said, "You didn't invite us to the dinner," and let that sentence stand alone like an unguarded doorway. She inhaled sharply and replied, "That's not relevant," which is what people say when something is very relevant and very inconvenient. I told her relevance changes when money is involved, and she fell silent long enough for me to hear my own breathing again. I could picture her calculating, replaying the seating chart in her head, wondering which face she decided didn't matter. She said, "We didn't think you'd care," and I smiled. Not bitterly, but with recognition, because that's how people explain decisions they didn't want witnessed. I answered, "Care isn't loud, Yulia. It's just expensive when ignored." Marlena stood up, rinsed an already clean cup, and said softly, "You're being generous," which was her way of saying I was still holding the door open. I told Yulia we would not rush a decision and suggested she take the night to think about priorities, not numbers. Her voice tightened, and she asked, "So, is that a no?" I replied, "It's a pause," and ended the call before she could fill the space with assumptions. As the room settled back into quiet, I realized this was the moment expectations begin to crack, right before someone pushes harder. The night didn't bring sleep, it brought clarity, which is louder and far less negotiable. I lay there counting decisions I'd already made, not sheep, and Marlena breathed evenly beside me like a metronome that never misses a beat. In the morning, Yulia sent a voice message instead of a call, which told me she wanted control without interruption. Her tone was softer now, measured, as if volume had been the problem all along and not judgment. She spoke about stress, about being overwhelmed, and I smiled at the ceiling because overwhelmed people usually remember to invite their parents to dinners. I stood up, bumped my knee on the coffee table, muttered an apology to the furniture, and thought, even the house knows who was here first. Marlena handed me toast that had cooled on purpose. She knows I think better when nothing rushes me. I listened to the message twice, not to understand it, but to hear what wasn't said. No apology, no acknowledgement, no recognition of the line she'd crossed. When I finally called back, she answered on the first ring, relief sneaking through before she could stop it. I told her we'd reviewed our finances carefully, which was true, though not in the way she imagined. She asked if we could help, and I replied that help follows respect the way shadow follows light. There was a long pause, and I let it stretch until it became instructional. She said, "I didn't mean to hurt you," and I answered, "Intent doesn't erase impact, it just explains it." Marlena coughed to hide a laugh when I said that, because she knows I only sound like this when I'm being very patient. I told Yulia we'd meet in person before any money was discussed, and her hesitation told me she'd hoped for distance to do the heavy lifting. When the call ended, I realized she was no longer asking for money. She was testing how far the ground would move under her feet. We agreed to meet at a cafe Yulia chose, one of those places that tries very hard to feel important. Exposed brick, menus longer than the Constitution, chairs designed by someone who hates sitting. I arrived early on purpose, ordered plain coffee, and watch the room the way you watch weather, not people. Marlena was 10 minutes behind me, which was exactly on time. She believes punctuality is flexible when it serves observation. Yulia walked in already talking, phone in hand, eyes scanning for witnesses before they found us. She hugged Marlena first, a fraction too tight, then kissed my cheek like she was sealing a contract she hadn't read. We sat, and I noticed she didn't order anything. Another small sign that she planned to stay only as long as necessary. She started with logistics again, numbers, embarrassment, how close everything was to falling apart, and I nodded like a man listening to a weather forecast he can't change. When the waiter asked if I wanted anything else, I said no, then knocked my spoon onto the floor and watched it roll away like it had other plans. Yulia flinched at the sound, and Marlena smiled politely at the waiter and said, "He does that when he's thinking," which was only half a joke. I leaned forward and said, "Before we talk about money, tell me who was at the dinner." And I didn't raise my voice because gravity doesn't need volume. She listed names quickly, too quickly, like she was afraid one of them might hear us now and object. I waited until she finished and said, "Interesting," which made her straighten her back the way children do when they sense a test. She asked what I meant, and I replied, "You surrounded yourself with people who applauded you, then came to us for silence and funding." Marlena added, calmly, "That's not balance. That's extraction." Yulia laughed nervously and said we were being dramatic, and I smiled, because people only say that when the story isn't going their way. I told her we hadn't decided yet, and she exhaled sharply, frustration breaking through the polish for the first time. As we stood to leave, I knew this meeting hadn't been about persuasion at all. It had been about seeing whether we'd still bend in public. On the drive home, Marlena didn't speak right away, which told me she was organizing facts, not feelings. I took a wrong turn we've taken 100 times and blamed the sun, then corrected myself and said, "Apparently the road changed while we were at the cafe." She smiled and said, "No, you just stopped pretending you're on autopilot," and I appreciated the accuracy. That afternoon, I pulled out documents I hadn't reviewed in years, the kind that don't argue back and don't need approval. I noticed Yulia had never asked how we would give the money, only when, which is a very specific kind of confidence. Marlena brewed tea and forgot the kettle on the stove, letting it whistle like it had something urgent to say, and she calmly turned it off mid-scream. We sat at the table and went over timelines, not out of fear, but out of respect for consequences. I realized then that the dinner hadn't been an oversight. It had been a rehearsal for exclusion. When people practice leaving you out, they eventually forget you can still walk away on your own terms. Yulia texted again, short, polite, rehearsed, and I set the phone face down like a card I wasn't ready to play. I told Marlena, "She thinks this is about money," and she replied, "That's because money is the only language she used with us." I laughed quietly when I found my glasses on my head after searching the whole house, because clarity has a sense of humor. By evening, the decision was no longer forming. It had settled, solid and unmovable. I picked up the phone, not to respond yet, but to confirm that silence was still working exactly as intended. When Yulia finally called again that night, I answered with a calm I knew she wouldn't recognize until it was too late.
I took the phone from my husband before he could say a word, not because he needed saving, but because this moment belonged to me. Yulia stiffened the instant she heard my voice. Mothers know that sound, the one that says the room just changed shape. I didn't ask how she was, and I didn't ask why she called again so late. Questions invite detours, and I wasn't offering any. I told her I'd been thinking about that dinner, about the guest list, about how carefully it had been curated without us. She tried to interrupt, and I let her, because letting someone talk themselves into a corner is a kindness. While she explained, I folded laundry with surgical precision, pairing socks that had been mismatched for years, amused by how clarity sharpens even the smallest tasks. I said, "You know what struck me most?" and waited until she said no, because she always says no when she's nervous. I told her it wasn't that we weren't invited, it was that she thought we wouldn't notice, or worse, that noticing wouldn't matter. She laughed softly, the same laugh she used as a teenager when she'd already made up her mind and hoped tone would carry her through. I reminded her that silence isn't ignorance. Sometimes it's a ledger and every entry is remembered. My husband tried to hand me a pen, missed, and dropped it on the floor, and I said, "Leave it, because nothing needed correcting anymore." Yulia asked if this was about punishment, and I smiled, because that word always comes from people who've confused boundaries with revenge. I told her calmly, "This is about alignment. And right now, you and we are not aligned." There was a long pause, and for the first time, I heard uncertainty instead of impatience on the other end. When she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter, but the ground beneath her had already started to shift. The next morning, Yulia showed up at our house without calling, which told me urgency had finally outrun pride. I opened the door slowly, not to make a point, but because haste has never improved first impressions. She stepped inside and looked around like she was checking whether the furniture still remembered her. My husband offered coffee and immediately reached for the wrong jar, scooping sugar into the filter instead of the cup, then paused and said, "Well, that explains some past decisions," which nearly made me laugh. Yulia didn't sit down right away. She hovered, the way people do when they hope to leave unchanged. She said the money was needed sooner than expected, that things had shifted, that people were asking questions. I nodded and asked, which people, because vague crowds are often imaginary until you name them. She listed names that had all been present at that dinner, and I felt the shape of the truth settle neatly into place. I told her, so the people who mattered enough to celebrate with you aren't the ones carrying the weight now. She flushed and said it wasn't fair, and I replied that fairness isn't negotiated after decisions are made. My husband leaned on the counter, knocked his elbow into the fruit bowl, and sent an apple rolling across the floor like it was escaping the conversation. He picked it up, inspected it, and said, "Still good," which somehow landed harder than any lecture. I explained that money doesn't move toward disrespect, no matter how loud the emergency becomes. Yulia finally sat down, shoulders lower, voice tighter, and asked what we wanted from her. I said, "We already wanted something simple, and you decided it wasn't important." The room went quiet, not tense, but exact, like a measurement finally taken correctly. That's when Yulia realized this wasn't a negotiation anymore, it was an accounting. Yulia stayed longer than she intended, which told me her confidence had finally run out of shortcuts. She asked again about the money, this time more carefully, as if careful wording might rebuild what speed had damaged. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I straightened a picture frame that had been crooked for years and said, "Funny how some things only bother you once everything else is unstable." My husband sat down beside me and reached for his glasses, which were already on his face, then muttered, "I swear they move when I'm not looking," giving Yulia a momentary smile she didn't earn. I told her we had reviewed everything, accounts, obligations, timelines, not because we were worried, but because we respect consequences. She asked whether we could help, and I corrected her gently. The question was never whether we could. I reminded her that when she decided who mattered at her wedding, she also decided who she'd stand with when things became uncomfortable. She tried to say it wasn't personal, and I said that family decisions are always personal, even when people pretend otherwise. Her voice cracked, not loudly, not theatrically, but enough to signal fear had finally replaced impatience. I told her that desperation doesn't rewrite history, it only reveals how lightly it was written in the first place. My husband stood up, knocked his knee against the chair, and said, "That chair's been waiting to trip me for years," then looked at Yulia and added, "Some things wait. Others rush. You chose rushing." She asked if there was anything she could do now, and I answered honestly, "You can listen without planning your next sentence." For the first time, she actually did, and the silence stretched not heavy, not cruel, just truthful. I said we weren't closing doors, but we were no longer opening them automatically. She nodded slowly, like someone finally realizing the room has rules they didn't write. When Yulia left, her steps were quieter than when she arrived, and I knew the real confrontation was still ahead. The silence after Yulia left wasn't empty. It was arranged, like a room after furniture has been moved to its proper place. My husband leaned against the counter and said, "Well," then forgot what came after "well," which made me smile because even pressure can't erase habit. I told him, She's not done, and he nodded, already knowing people who rush once always try again, louder. That afternoon, messages started arriving not from Yulia, but from others, relatives, acquaintances, people suddenly concerned about our family dynamic. I read each one slowly and answered none, because borrowed voices never carry truth. My husband tried to help by fixing the loose cabinet hinge, tightened the wrong screw, and ended up holding the door in his hand like a guilty accomplice. He looked at it, looked at me, and said, "That's how you know it was overdue," which felt appropriate on multiple levels. By evening, Yulia finally called again, and this time she didn't open with money. She said she felt pushed out, and I almost laughed at the symmetry, but restraint is a skill you polish with age. I told her calmly, "You weren't pushed. You stepped forward and didn't look back." She said people were starting to ask why we weren't involved, and I replied that curiosity usually arrives after consequences. My husband cleared his throat, not nervously, but like a man preparing to say something final, then let me continue. I explained that reputation built on convenience collapses the moment convenience disappears. She asked if we were embarrassed by her, and I answered honestly, no. We're disappointed by your math. The line went quiet again, longer this time, and I knew she was finally counting something other than money. When the call ended, I realized this was the point where she would either accept the lesson or try to force the ending. The pressure didn't come from Yulia that night, it came from the edges, which is how real pressure always works. A cousin called, then an old family friend, both pretending to check on us while carefully circling the same question. I answered one of them while slicing vegetables, missed the cutting board by an inch, and said calmly, "If I lose a finger, I'll still keep my boundaries," which ended that conversation quickly. My husband listened from the other room, tried to fix the radio volume, and somehow turned it off entirely, muttering, "Technology sides with chaos," like it was a long-standing feud. By morning, Yulia sent a longer message than usual, measured, polite, and clearly revised several times. She wrote about embarrassment now, about how people were talking, about how the absence of parents at key moments invites speculation. I read it once, then again, not because it was unclear, but because it revealed something new. Fear of loss had finally replaced entitlement. I told my husband, "She's not asking for money anymore," and he nodded and said, "She's asking for insulation." We agreed to meet again, not to negotiate, but to finish the conversation she kept trying to restart. At the restaurant, Yulia arrived early and stood when we approached, a small gesture that would have mattered more a week ago. She apologized not fully, not cleanly, but enough to show she understood something had shifted beyond repair. My husband sat down, reached for the salt before tasting anything, stopped himself and said, "Old habits," which made the waiter smile and Yulia flinch. I told her the truth without raising my voice. When parents are excluded publicly, trust doesn't recover privately. She asked if this meant she was losing us, and I replied, "No. It means you're meeting us where we actually stand." Her eyes filled, not with drama, but with calculation, because some people only cry once the numbers stop working. As we stood to leave, I knew the next step wouldn't be hers to take. That night, after the restaurant, my husband and I didn't talk much, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the shape of the ending had already formed. He tried to hang his coat, missed the hook, and let it slide onto the chair instead, saying, "Gravity is very confident today," and I smiled because even small failures feel lighter when big decisions are settled. Yulia called once more before midnight, her voice careful now, almost respectful, like someone approaching a line they finally see. She said she understood if we were hurt, that weddings are chaotic, that things get decided quickly, which told me she still believed speed could excuse selection. I told her calmly that chaos doesn't choose guests, values do. She asked whether the money was still off the table, and I answered that money had never been on the table, only expectations. My husband cleared his throat and added, evenly, "We don't fund rehearsals for a future where we're optional." There was silence, then a small sound, something between a sigh and a swallow, when Yulia realized there would be no dramatic reversal. She tried one last angle, softer than before, saying she wanted us there, that she missed how things used to be. I replied, "You didn't miss us when you were counting chairs." After the call ended, my husband tried to set an alarm, accidentally turned on the flashlight, and said, "Well, at least we can see clearly now," which felt like an accidental summary. I sat at the table and thought about how often parents confuse endurance with obligation and how easily that mistake becomes a habit. We didn't feel angry, and we didn't feel victorious. We felt precise, like people who finally placed the last piece where it belonged. That was when I knew the decision we'd made wouldn't punish Yulia, but it would finally educate her. The next morning, she would learn exactly what standing your ground quietly can change forever. In the morning, the house felt lighter, not quieter, lighter, the way a room does after you finally open a window that's been stuck for years. My husband burned the toast slightly, stared at it, and said, "I always overdo it when I'm confident," then scraped it calmly and ate it anyway, because waste is unnecessary even on decisive days. We didn't call Yulia, and we didn't wait for her to call us, because endings don't require announcements when they're clean. Instead, we transferred funds, not to her, but to where they had always belonged: our own plans, our own security, our own timeline. My husband double-checked the numbers, misread one line, checked again, and smiled when it matched, saying, "Good." Still ours, like a quiet oath. Later that day, Yulia finally called, her voice stripped of urgency, of strategy, of shortcuts. She asked if we had decided, and I answered simply yes. "We have." There was a pause, then she asked what that meant, and I told her the truth without decoration. We would be present in her life, but not available for erasure. Money would no longer arrive to smooth over disrespect, and silence would no longer be mistaken for consent. She didn't argue this time. She only said she understood, which I believed, not because she agreed, but because she had no leverage left to misunderstand. After the call, my husband tried to water the plants and forgot to move one out of the sun, then shrugged and said, "They'll adapt," and I thought how fitting that was. We sat together in the afternoon light, not holding hands dramatically, just sharing space that no one could rearrange without permission. There was no triumph in us, no bitterness either, only balance restored and a line redrawn exactly where it should have been all along. We didn't break. We didn't rush. We didn't disappear. We stood our ground quietly, and that was enough to win.